Yes, so bit of a cryptic title. I'll explain why I've got a question mark on why I've chosen this title soon. But just to say, I'm part of the Scotland team here for butterfly conservation. I'm one of the conservation managers. But I was asked to do a talk last year for the fourth naturalist and historian group. They have a journal, and they're mostly based around the Forth area, but they've got a journal. And in the first edition of the journal, back in 1976, they had an article by a man called George Thompson called Our Disappearing Butterflies. So I was asked to do an update on that article and give a talk last year, and I've given a further update on it for you today. So we'll kind of go through what's happening with butterflies. Are they disappearing? Some will be, some won't. So we'll go through it today. But I thought this quote was quite interesting. He started his article by saying, "There's a general impression amongst the adult population in Scotland that there are fewer butterflies about today than in their youth. Like nothing much changes. We always think there are fewer for sure. Many knowledgeable naturalists also believe that this is the case." So George is really trying to interrogate that assumption. And it's true that back in 1976, most of the changes that George was commenting on had occurred before 1900. So we're going back multiple generations here. But of course, a lot has changed since then. So I'll be reflecting on some of these changes today. Now, in our latest big report on this, it's the State of UK Butterflies 2022. One of the top statements from it was that 80% of UK butterfly species are declining. That's in their range, where they're found, or their abundance in their numbers. So the vast majority are declining in some way, but that's not really the whole picture. If we look at Scotland, this is just one of the measures. This is the abundance indicator. You can see the red lines there show that the wider countryside species, these are the ones that can breed in urban areas or in intensive farmland, are increasing in their number. Whereas the habitat specialists, the ones that require particular conditions, those decreased in the 1970s and have stayed low ever since. But it's complicated. So let's look at the holly blue. Last year we had a fantastic talk by Chris Stamp on the holly blue. But back in 1976, George Thompson said that the holly blue has appeared in Dumfries back in 1950 and has apparently spread to other localities south of the border. So it was spreading by then. If you look at the map, these are the records in 2016. It wasn't really doing much. It was around Edinburgh, some on the west coast as well. But since 2022, their numbers have exploded. This is the post-2016 map of the species. And as you can see, it's really romped away up the east coast. Just for a tiny butterfly to increase its range so rapidly, it shows that butterflies really can surprise us. They can get around on their own steam. I'm sure there aren't people out there moving holly blue around the country. They're doing it themselves. And this could be an example of just a species that's flexible. They can use holly and ivy for their caterpillars, but they can lay their eggs in many other plants. So they're possibly just taking advantage of climate change, but also just being adaptable and generalist. So the reason I'm trying to put reasons for all of these, but most of them have a question mark at the end of it because I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows the whole situation, but possibly plenty of food and suitable climate could be resulting in the holly blues increases, but also possibly outpacing their parasites. They have these tiny parasitic wasps that will lay their eggs inside their caterpillars. At the moment, they might be outpacing those, and it certainly seems that in the east, that big boom has been followed by a bust. So it might be that the parasites are catching up with them. Now, common blue and small copper, I've grouped them together because George Thompson did the same. In 1976, he wrote that small copper and common blue are found throughout the central belt more or less commonly, frequently repopulating derelict land. You can imagine that after World War II and things like that, there would have been a lot of derelict land. But they're not doing so well nowadays, so both species have had a decrease in their UK distribution of 37% since the 1970s, so roughly a third. And if you look at the map of Scotland in particular, most of the pale areas on that map show places where they haven't been seen since about the 1990s or early 2000s. And that roughly is about a third or so. These are places where these formerly common and widespread butterflies are disappearing from. Now, what might be the reason for it? Well, both of them favor short, species-rich grassland, and that's really a disappearing resource, especially in farmland. They can be seen in places like this, where you can see fine grasses, rocks coming through, and various herbs. So possibly changes to agriculture are the main culprit for the reasons behind the distribution changes for both of these species. development of land as well. So probably around urban areas, some of these former derelict sites are being swallowed up for housing. But I think possibly agriculture is possibly the main reason for these two. Now, the small skipper, so in 1976, this is a really interesting one. Thompson wrote that this butterfly could well have been more widespread in the past, but only just survived into the 19th century in Scotland. So really the early 1800s was the last time the small skipper was seen in Scotland until relatively recently. So just around 2011, they started creeping north of the border, coming back into Scotland. This is the map from 2011 to 2026, and you can see they've done extremely well. For a species that hasn't been here in a very long time, almost 200 years, they're doing very well nowadays. So the reasons possibly could be because plenty of food, once again. You can see this is a picture of one of the larvae on the screen here. The larvae remain inside the stems of the plants through the winter. So a lot of the councils leaving grasses longer and things are probably helping this species get around, but also climate change as well. Another one for the climate. So that's why I speculate on this species. But it's not the only skipper that's expanding. The checkered skipper, for years we were really worried about the checkered skipper. You know, it was so restricted on the west of Scotland. The entire UK population was there, and it was a really top priority species for conservation work. It is still a priority species, but again, under its own steam, the checkered skipper is moving. You can see those areas highlighted in red. These are places where the checkered skipper has expanded into. It's been found on Mull recently and on Skye, and seems to be generally increasing. Again, it's probably in that area of the west coast of Scotland because of climate. There's warm, well, not really warm summers, but longer summers. I'll give them longer summers, where the kind of frosts are a bit later in the year, allow the caterpillars of this butterfly to reach the stage that they need to reach to survive the winter. If they don't reach that stage, they won't survive the winter. So possibly our slightly longer summers nowadays with fewer frosts are allowing the checker skipper to expand its range. So climate again, roughly. Now, the comma is an interesting one. People get very excited about the comma, and still, I think that's correct. But in 1976 was regarded as being extinct in Scotland. The only previous record I can find in our database before the year 2000 was Alloa, so just down the road, in 1875 as a breeding butterfly. Now, the Millennium Atlas of butterflies, which came out in the year 2000, they had a really fascinating quote. It says, "It appears to be on the verge of recolonizing Scotland and its immediate future seems favourable." 1 year later, it was in Scotland. So if they had waited by 1 year, so they were obviously they could see the trend, they could see the species increasing. So recorded as breeding again in Scotland in 2001. This is the 2016 map. You can see that it's everywhere. And even since then, 2025, done ahead. So really the most northern part of mainland UK, it's up there. So again, a butterfly is getting around under its own steam, but I think it's a bit more complicated than just climate with this one. So climate, yes, will be helping. But also, like many stories, good stories, they start in the pub. So in the past, people would have preserved, well, beer was possibly one of the safest things to drink in the past before, you know, whenever the water supply was quite dirty. But back then they didn't have our techniques for sterilization, but they would use hops. So hops are a natural antiseptic. They don't just give a nice citrusy flavor to your IPA, they are also antiseptic. So in the past, this is what was commonly used. The caterpillars of comma were known as hop cats. They were a pest of hop plants. Now, obviously, then whenever things changed, technology changed, sterilization came in, and hops went into decline. So a lot of the hop plants were taken down, hops disappeared from the countryside. So hops declined and the comma declined as well. This is one of the theories, along with climate, about why they declined. They were almost extinct in the UK, found only one or two populations on the Welsh border. But then they did a trick. They did a switcheroo. So it's believed that there might have been a kind of a race of comma that were always using nettles for their caterpillar food plant. Nettles are in the same plant family as hops and elms, so the Ulmaceae. So it possibly wasn't too much of a switch for them. They started using nettles, a much more widespread and common plant. Then combine that with climate, and you've got a butterfly that can really spread through the countryside again. And this is possibly one of the reasons why commas are coming back and being quite common nowadays. But its close cousin, the small tortoiseshell, they're really having a bad time of it. So again, Thompson says that small tortoiseshells can be found everywhere, including our larger towns. That's still true for some people, but there's been a 79% decrease in abundance of the small tortoiseshell since the 1970s. What was once one of our commonest species is now becoming basically a non-breeding butterfly in many parts of the UK. They just don't breed there anymore. So the larvae feed on nettles, so shouldn't they be found everywhere? Nettles, fairly common plant. Now, more research though is finding that drought in early summer is linked to poor breeding success with small tortoiseshell. You can imagine the caterpillars out in summertime. If the plants aren't growing, if there's not enough nitrogen coming into them, those caterpillars just won't have much to feed upon. So in places in the UK where we're getting more droughts, this could be the reason why small tortoiseshells are declining there. In Scotland, though, last year, May to July was very dry in 2025, so it'll be interesting to see whether we have an impact this year on the numbers of small tortoiseshells coming through. But that's not it. That's not everything. So there's also been a fly implicated in it. There's a fly called Sturmia bella. So this little fly lays its eggs upon nettles. Then they get consumed by the larvae of small tortoiseshells, and then they eat the caterpillars from the inside out. So bad news for the caterpillars. This fly isn't native to the UK. It was either brought here or got here because of climate change, and it seems that it's in the south and might be spreading north. So there's possibly a couple of factors in the decreases in small tortoiseshells. I'm not going to show a map of orange tips because they're one of our commonest and most widespread butterfly species now, but I just like the fact. So in 1979, George Thomson was still on the case. He wrote an article in the Fourth Naturalist and said, "Has the orange tip butterfly arrived yet?" And he was asking people, if you find one, get a specimen of it to prove that it's here. And as we know, orange tips are one of our commonest, a lovely butterfly to see in springtime, but again, possibly increasing because of climate change now. Now, coming on to some of the brown butterflies, this is intriguing. So basically, George Thomson reckoned that the wall butterfly was found everywhere from Aberdeen in the east to Glasgow in the west, so a really common butterfly. But when Thomson was writing in 1976, it was extinct, hadn't been seen here since the late 1800s until 1976 at least. It took a while, but and this is the pre-20 or 2006 map, but as you can see, it started to move north of the border again. And as you can see, it's increasing further and further every year. And again, really infilling, so not just staying to the coast, but coming inland as well. Many people saw their first wall butterfly ever last year, and so they're really becoming a much more common species, which is a good thing because they've actually experienced an 86% decline in UK distribution since between 1970 and 2019. You can see this part of the country here. Basically, the Midlands and much of central England now is devoid of wall butterflies. And this is where we're losing them, and they seem to be coming north. Now, this is an interesting one as well, so I'll stick with it for a while. You might know that many caterpillars, many species can only survive the winter at a certain stage. For the wall butterfly, this is what's called the third instar. Basically, the caterpillar starts off tiny, sheds its skin a couple of times, and will survive the winter in the third instar stage. It can't survive as an adult or an egg or a younger caterpillar. It must reach third instar stage and stay there. However, it's scorchio in the middle of England now. So it basically is a climate trap. So what happens is instead of hibernating, those caterpillars are continuing to develop. They become adults at the end of summer, and then they can't survive the winter, and their larvae can't survive the winter. It's getting too warm there, but Scotland seems to be the place now where wall butterfly will thrive. So an interesting one there. I've grouped meadow brown and small heath together because Thomson did so. He says meadow brown and small heath are widespread and sometimes common. But the small heath has had a 76% decline in UK distribution since the 70s, but meadow brown only 22%. What could be the factor there? So again, I think it comes down to short grassland. Our small heath feed upon very fine-leaved grasses. They need areas of bare ground and things. Meadow brown feed on tall, vigorous grass, which is everywhere basically. And I think possibly the main reason is related to nitrogen in farmland. There's a lot more nitrogen on the ground nowadays. The climate has changed too, so the grass can grow tall, whereas we're losing those little small species-rich grasslands, which the small heath are in. Again, speculation, but I think it's a good enough theory here. Speckled wood, again, it was extinct, or not extinct, locally extinct in parts of Scotland. Thomson said it had disappeared from its old haunts. It wasn't found around Glasgow or Edinburgh anymore. But as you can see, this is one of the most dramatic changes. 2001, it was stuck in these kind of warm climate areas around Murray and in the coasts. 2016, it looked like that. 2026, it looks like this. So again, a butterfly that's getting everywhere. Again, it won't struggle because its caterpillars eat long grass. This is an important theme here. Long grass are the ones that are doing well. So climate change and abundant larval food. And I think maybe the thing that will limit the spread of this butterfly is just its reliance on trees. You never really see meadow brown away from, or sorry, speckled wood away from trees. So possibly it might stay away from the uplands where there aren't many trees, but I think everywhere else is fair game. The ringlet, I'm not going to talk too much about the ringlet just to save time, but basically you can see it's increasing dramatically too. One of the theories, though, for this species is that it really declined in the Victorian era and post in the industrial era in Scotland because of air pollution, with a lot of soot going onto the leaves that they eat. With cleaner air now, this is one that's possibly doing well because of climate plus cleaner air. Now, Northern Brown Argus, one of my favorite species. So this is a local story we're going to include here. It's had a 43% decline across the UK in its distribution since the 70s. But you might be familiar with some of the hills around here. The Ochil Hills provide a beautiful backdrop to Stirling University. One of the hills is called Dumayat, and the butterfly was regarded as being, in the 1850s, it was regarded as being not uncommon in the Ochil Hills around Menstrie and Logie. Yet when Thompson was writing, it was basically almost locally extinct, except for an area called Ulva Glen and then around there. The sheep numbers have become very high. They had grazed out the common rock rose that the butterfly needs, but the sheep have been taken off in the last 5 years or so, and the butterfly is responding very quickly. So it was believed extinct in Stirlingshire between 19... There weren't any records for 100 years between 1920 and 2020. However, this is where they were found. You can see them here in the east, where it's circled there. This is Ulva Glen and Craigleith. This is where sheep couldn't access, so they couldn't get in. This is where the butterfly was kind of stuck in these refuges. However, a few years ago, an ecologist called Ida Bailey, who lives in Blair Logie, sent this photograph from her garden. Blair Logie is just down the road from us. It's next door to us, basically. She found a Northern Brown Argus there. Then we speculated, had they flown the whole way from Ulva Glen just to end up in her garden? She had planted rock rose there, so they were breeding there. So we sent Ida on a mission. We sent her up onto the hills, into the very steep Ochil Hills, and she found the first eggs in the wild of the species in Stirlingshire. This is important for me because I'm the butterfly reporter for Stirlingshire. So just across the border, so they're back within my vice county now, which is good to know. So she found the first eggs, but we didn't stop there. So one of our volunteers, Stuart, he's been out looking for them, and he's found more colonies, as you can see circled there. So more colonies of Northern Brown Argus in and around this area, which is really great to see for a struggling species. This is one of the ones I found. We went on a hunt one day and we found them up on one of the crags up high. This is a Northern Brown Argus in possibly the scratchiest, dirtiest pot I had, with some nice Stirling landmarks behind. But yeah, it was nice to see that. My point here, though, is that habitat specialists can disappear, but they can reappear if conditions are made right. And this is what we need to do through butterfly conservation. We can't just accept that they're going to disappear. We need to help them out. Coming kind of just another species getting towards the end now. Thompson didn't even mention white-letter hair streak. Wasn't on his mind. Well, it might have been on his mind, but he didn't mention it in the article. But they first arrived in Scotland in 2017. And as you can see, they've done extremely well. They came across the border on the east coast. They were first seen in Edinburgh in 2024, and in the same year, they jumped to Dundee. So again, a tiny little butterfly getting around on its own steam somehow. So clearly they can surprise us, as you can see here. But they've also just appeared on the west coast as well. So at Langham this year, they were discovered on the west coast. So clearly they're spreading up east and west coasts. Now, coming towards the end, but I've got a few more slides. So are disappearing butterflies is still a question mark. It's obviously complicated. They're not all going to do the same things. It's kind of a chaotic time. People call it climate breakdown or climate chaos. It does feel a bit chaotic out there. Species are returning to Scotland. Some are arriving for the first time. Others are expanding their ranges, but it tends to be those that are generalist, especially those ones that can feed on long grass. They're just doing extremely well now, and nettle feeders too. But those that need short species-rich grassland are declining, and they really need special conditions, but they can respond if we help them and the conditions change. Add into the mix, so new parasites and disease, these are also likely having an impact. So again, it is complicated. But we've got a talk later on from Lisbeth, my colleague Lisbeth, and she'll be talking about moths. So yeah, wait till you hear what they're up to, because yeah, there's a lot going on there. So now, fun time, we can speculate. So what next? So there's rumblings of gatekeeper coming into the Dumfries. You might notice the person who photographed this was George Thompson, the original author of the article. I don't know whether he placed himself in Dumfries so he could check what was coming over the border, but nevertheless, he got the photograph that confirmed that gatekeeper are here. Brimstone, I know people are planting the larval food plant, so alder buckthorn doesn't really grow naturally here. People are planting it hoping to tempt the brimstone to breed. They do come in as immigrants, but I don't know if they're breeding here yet. Clouded yellow as well might start to breed. But let's cast our mind further. What about purple emperor? They're moving north every year. They're doing extremely well. The caterpillars feed on willow. Maybe in the next 10 years, we might see them. What about a white admiral? Again, moving north. Caterpillars feed upon honeysuckle. So again, very common plant. Big butterfly, can fly around quickly. Even the wee butterflies can fly around and distribute themselves. And what about silver wash fritillary too? So these are some of the kind of tempting species that might be here the next year. I'll be interested to hear your speculations over lunch as well, and maybe we can have a vote to see who thinks what will come in. But yeah, 50 years from now, goodness knows what goodness knows what it's going to be like. So just to say, those are some speculations. But we need your help with other species this year. So these are some of the priorities. I'll be sending an email next week to talk about some of our priorities for recording this year. I'll be running events for Pearl Border Fritillary in Killin, Loch Katrine and Dunkeld. Epiphany will be doing a load of events for the Northern Brown Argus in the Borders just south of Edinburgh, so please get involved in those. But we'll be doing some online things as well, so I will be sending those out next week. And why does this matter? So this is just a random bit of the borders that I picked out. These are records of Northern Brown Argus you have there. So if we want to conserve something, we need to know where it is. So as you can see in the borders, there are many applications now for industrial forestry schemes and things going in. You can see some of them just to the west of some of those sites. If we don't know where things are, we can't conserve them. So thank you for everybody who's helped in sending in their records already, but we need more of your help to really find out where things are so that we can help in the conservation of them. So thank you very much for listening, but also special thanks to George Thompson for his articles and books. He published an updated version of the Butterflies of Scotland last year with new maps, so you might want to seek that out online. But thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Brilliant. So my name is Claire and I joined Butterfly Conservation quite recently as their Glasgow Wild Spaces Officer. The project is quite new, so this is going to be a very quick intro into what we've got planned, and then hopefully you'll hear more about the project as it continues. So just a wee introduction on Wild Spaces as a whole. Wild Spaces is Butterfly Conservation's flagship engagement programme. And through the programme, we aim to engage with new audiences, including people that we have previously sort of struggled to engage with, which includes people who live in areas of economic and green space deprivation, people aged under 35, and people from minoritised ethnic backgrounds. And we want to inspire people to transform spaces for butterflies and moths by taking small actions to try and get everyone involved, no matter their background or experience. So what is a wild space? Well, simply put, a wild space is anywhere that provides some habitat for butterflies and moths. So anywhere where they can thrive, basically. So somewhere that provides nectar sources for adults, food plants for caterpillars, and shelter where they can overwinter as well. And wild spaces can be anywhere, including in urban environments. And that's very much our focus with the Glasgow project. And they can be all shapes and sizes. So we'll be creating some meadow sites and parks and green spaces, but also a wild space could be something much smaller, just a pot of pollinator-friendly flowers in someone's garden. And as well as being great for wildlife, we think that wild spaces are also great for people. So they provide opportunities to discover butterflies and moths and connect to nature, improve the quality of urban green spaces, empower people with knowledge and passion to take action for nature in their local communities, give the opportunity to discover new knowledge, learn new skills, and also provide the chance to work together as communities to improve their local areas for nature. So Glasgow Wild Spaces was inspired by two previous wild space projects. There was the Stirling and Perth project, which focused more on communities and local green spaces, and then the Bristol project, which was very focused on work with schools. So Glasgow is a new 2-year project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we are going to do a bit of both just to keep things interesting. So what are our major project outputs? Well, one of the main things that we look to achieve is to create wild spaces in 15 parks and green spaces across Glasgow. And this is very much a partnership with Glasgow City Council because it's their land, but we're also looking to work with local communities to get them involved in shaping and creating their wild spaces. And in addition to that, we're also going to provide support and resources to other community groups so we can sort of spread the word about wild spaces and support people to create their own in their local areas. Schools work is also a really important part of the Wild Space project. So this is a really lovely photo of some of the kids that took part in our project launch. You might have seen that on the news. It was featured on BBC Scotland News. Lots of very happy faces, getting involved in some planting activities. It was a really, really good day. So this is a really important part of the project to try and engage the younger generation in butterflies and moths. So we'll be creating wild spaces in school grounds, but it's very much a collaboration with the school pupils and staff. They'll be involved in the design and they'll have the opportunity to learn more about butterflies and moths, their habitats, their life cycles as well. We'll also be doing lots of events over the course of the project, including public events to engage people about wild spaces and encourage them to create their own. We'll also have family activities and training workshops about identification and recording. And we really hope to engage lots of volunteers in the project. So we already have a fantastic branch who are obviously very experienced in the Glasgow area and have lots of knowledge, but we hope to recruit lots of additional volunteers to get involved in the project in lots of different ways. So people can get involved in the practical side of things, helping to create and maintain the wild spaces. We are also hoping to recruit people to record what's there and then record what's there again, hopefully after the wild spaces are created, and we'll hopefully see that some new butterflies and moths have been attracted to these sites. And we'll have lots of volunteers who are also involved in the engagement and education side to share their passion for butterflies and moths and hopefully encourage the public to take action. So on the ground work is due to begin soon. So if you live in the Glasgow area or surrounding areas and you'd like to get in touch, please do let me know. You can come and find me today or you can pop me an email. We're really, really keen to get new people involved, but I think it would also be fantastic to get some people who are already knowledgeable and experienced to kind of pass that knowledge on, because we'd love to create a new generation of recorders who get out there and record for butterflies and moths, a new generation of people who are creating species and habitats for butterflies and moths as well.
Right. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Thank you ever so much for having me here to talk about the dark-bordered beauty moth. As the brief instructor said, my name's Adam. I am the experienced invertebrate keeper at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, working on the field conservation team. I'm based up at Highland Wildlife Park in the Cairngorms, and my role is around the husbandry and management of our conservation breeding species of our native invertebrates. The dark-bordered beauty is a species that I've been working on now for 4 years, and along with our partners, we've been making good steps into actually helping to conserve this species, and I'll be talking a little bit about that today and the work that we've been doing with our collaborative partners. So I'll do a brief introduction to RZSS before I get started. RZSS is a conservation charity that runs 2 zoological collections in Edinburgh Zoo and Highland Wildlife Park, where I'm based. But we also have a designated conservation department that works with projects around the globe, including our genetics lab down in Edinburgh, that does a lot of good genetic work. We work on a huge range of different projects right across the globe, and this map shows a bit of that sort of range and spread of the different species projects that we work on. However, we have a really heavy focus on native species conservation because they're right here in our back garden and we can make a really big impact with those. Our native species projects range right the way through from mammals and birds through to fish and invertebrates. And invertebrates make a big part of our native species conservation work. All of these projects are based at Highland Wildlife Park, and we're involved working with them there. In total, of the 6 species we work with, 5 of them are conservation breed for release projects. These are the dark-bordered beauty moth, which is the one I'll be talking about a little bit more today. We've also got the pine hoverfly, which is one of our most iconic projects. We've got the pond mud snail, the medicinal leech, and the blood-red longhorn beetle. The longhorn beetle involves a lot more habitat work from us as well, doing surveys to try and better understand what's going on with this population. But we're also fortunate enough to do work with the small scabious mining bee. This isn't a species we actually do breeding work with, but we're fortunate enough to have a population of this rare bee on site at Highland Wildlife Park, right next to our wolverine and snow leopard enclosures. So we use this population as a method of looking at habitat restoration work as part of our biodiversity action plan, but it's also used as a research opportunity. We do mark recapture studies on this species, so we can look at distribution, foraging distances, habitat preferences, weather preferences, that's able to then feed back into the wider conservation of this species. Now, it's probably not the room I need to talk about this too, but why are we interested in conserving invertebrates? In total, 40% of invertebrates are at risk of extinction globally, so a very large proportion, and they're over 77% of all known species. However, in the purposes of reintroduction and breeding programs, there's only 13% of those focus on invertebrates, so they're really underrepresented as far as this sort of conservation breeding side of things. They're incredibly important for pollination, to dispose of waste materials, they're predators, and they're also important prey species, so vital to a lot of the ecosystems that we work with. Because of this need to do work with native invertebrates and the focus needs to go into them, RZSS is heavily invested in our native invertebrate conservation work. Up at Highland Wildlife Park, we now have 3 different invertebrate facilities that are specially designed to work on these species and to conserve them and breed them as effectively as we can. The top left image is of our dark-bordered beauty moth facility specifically. We have 2 terrestrial facilities which are used for the moths and the hoverflies, and then an aquatic one that's used for all the aquatic species. These buildings have 2 rooms in them each for the animals. We have a larval room, which in the moth's case we use for rearing the eggs and the caterpillars, and then they progress into the flight room during the flight season, where we have room for the adults to actually exist in there as well. These rooms are air-conditioned, things like that, so we can mimic the conditions as best we can to best breed these species. But we also have a staffing contingent that is specifically on our native invertebrate work. At the moment, we've got 4 different people. So we've got Helen Stone, who's our head of conservation, Georgina Lindsay, who is our conservation manager, focusing on native invertebrates, myself, and then we've got Abby, who is our assistant conservation project officer. And all of us spend our time looking at these invertebrates and trying to champion them as best we can. So I'll go now down into more detail of the dark-bordered beauty moth. This is an absolutely stunning species that we've been working with now for 4 years, and in collaboration with our partners, we're working on good steps towards conserving the species further. Why are we interested in the dark-bordered beauty? It's a moth that's on the edge of extinction in the UK. It's classified as a UK Red Data Book species and endangered. It's a UK BAT priority species. It's on the Scottish Biodiversity List, and it's on the Cairngorms National Park Authority's action plan. In the UK, there's only 3 known populations of dark-bordered beauty moths. The first one is in Strathspey, right next to us at Highland Wildlife Park, and that's where our founder population came from. We've got another population over the other side of the Cairngorms Mountains in Deeside, and then another group down in Strensall in North Yorkshire. So very spread out. They're also found on the continent, but they're also showing similar declines over there as well. Now, the moth itself is absolutely stunning. I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but hey, I spend a lot of time looking at these guys. They're sexually dimorphic, so we can tell males and females nice and easily. The males have nice feathered antennae, as many other moth species do, compared to the females. They're a darker gold colour compared to the lovely brimstone yellow on the females. And the dark bands down the back of their wings, which the species gets its name from, on the females, tapers to the tip of the wing and has larger indents in it. So nice and easy for us to be able to tell who's who for the purpose of pairing them up in our facilities. The life cycle starts out as an egg. The adults lay these in July, and they stay as eggs right the way through the winter before they start to emerge out as caterpillars in May to June. They spend 4 to 6 weeks in this caterpillar stage before pupating. This happens usually in June and through to either late June or early July before they emerge out as adults and start the whole cycle again and complete in that single year. Dark-bordered beauty moths are suckers for aspen. Now, in Scotland, aspen seems to be the primary food plant for the species, and as far as we know, it's the sole food plant at the moment. The reason I say that is because the population down in North Yorkshire feeds on creeping willow, So we're actually going to be doing a project later this year at Hull and Wildlife Park with our captive individuals from Scotland to look and see if they are interested in feeding on creeping willow as well, to hopefully answer the question of whether the Scottish population will feed on creeping willow and then potentially in the future vice versa, to better understand the biology of the species. The caterpillars feed on the new growth, predominantly on aspen suckers. So where the aspen trees put out their roots and all the little suckers come up off those roots, that seems to be a very preferred habitat by the dark-border beauty because they love that bronzy coloured fresh growth on the ends of the branches. Because they have this quite specific habitat requirement, we work with our partner organisations as part of the Rare Invertebrates and Ecologists project. This includes RSPB, BugLife Scotland, Butterfly Conservation Scotland, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, Nature Scot and ourselves at RZSS to help work on habitat restoration for the species so that there are more places for us to put these guys in the future and help support the species long term. In order to do these releases, we have to work with other partners, including the Wildland Estate and private landowners as part of our release projects. Now, if anyone's interested in getting involved with any of the work with the Darkwater Beauty, but also the Kentish Glory, I've got an email address at the end of this presentation for the Rare Invertebrates and the Cairngorms project. We've also got Annie in the room here today, who is one of the officers with Rick, and we'll happily answer any questions, but feel free to chuck them at us. Now that we're working on conserving the habitat for this species, we need to have moths to put them out. And that is where we get involved as RZSS. So we have expertise and facilities to work with these species and to be able to breed them so that we've got individuals to put out for release. This is the life stage that we end up spending most of our time looking at. These are dark-border beauty moth eggs. So when they're first laid, they're white. After a few days, they go either red or yellow. We think this is likely a fertility indicator because the red eggs tend to emerge, whereas I haven't actually recorded anything with the yellow eggs so far, but we keep them all nonetheless just to make sure we can keep track of them. Over the winter months, we store them in these bug-dorm containers that are in the two right-hand images. They're literally just a plastic container with a piece of brown paper in the bottom. We pop the eggs in there. We spray it multiple times a week to keep the humidity up. And then we expose them to natural conditions as best we can. We have windows open, we have extractor fans on, so the eggs are seeing a normal temperature fluctuation that they would experience in the wild. When they get into the springtime, so usually this May period, we'll start to see the eggs change colour and they go grey. This gives us a little bit of warning of when they're going to come out. Admittedly, they still surprise me every time. But we usually get a little bit of a heads up when the moths are actually going to be emerging. And you can see in the two middle images, you can actually see the caterpillars starting to develop inside the eggs. And it's very cool to be able to see them starting to come through and then popping out as little caterpillars. The caterpillars, when they emerge out, are transferred into our larval rooms. In here, we've tried multiple different rearing methods over the last couple of years. Originally, we started more on cut aspen. So we'd collect aspen from on site at Highland Wildlife Park, pop it in pots of water that we plug with blue rolls so they don't drown in them. And then we put them into either the bug-dorm containers, which are in the bottom images, or the smaller pop-up enclosures in the bottom right. However, over the last couple of years, we've been trying out a way of updating our methodology, and we've actually been using planted aspen with them. So we buy aspens in and pop them into the enclosures with them. The idea with this is the caterpillars are not actually super hungry. They don't tend to strip a huge amount off or ending up wasting a lot of food, and it uses a lot of staff time. So what we've done is we've put 6 aspen trees in the enclosures with them, and then put 15 caterpillars in each and see how they got on. And they've done really well on this so far. It means we're disturbing them less, but it's also meaning it's much more time efficient for us. The enclosures, we try and mimic the temperatures that are exhibited over on inch marshes where they're originally from so that we can mimic that as closely as we can. But we also have them lit with LED lights to give them a normal day-night cycle. And as of this year, we're actually going to have an automatic sprayer system over the top to keep the enclosures damp and also provide drinking opportunities for everybody and to keep the trees supported. The caterpillars themselves are quite nondescript. They're about 3 millimeters long upon first hatching, and they usually dangle off a bit of silk, and that actually makes them quite easy to spot in the early stages. As they grow, they go more brown and they spend more time sitting on the branches of the aspen, which actually makes them really difficult to spot. We try and spot all of them every day to keep track of them. And this middle image is actually a bit of a test for everyone. So there are 5 caterpillars visible in this middle image. I will highlight them in a second, but see how many we can spot. So the easy mode of it are these 2 individuals that are just coming off the branches there. It's incredible camouflage. I wish these guys glowed under UV light. I tried it, they don't, I'm sad. But that would make our life so much easier. The next 2 are a little bit harder. They also use the edges of the enclosures, but they're quite good at sitting on the plants themselves. And the last one is the super hard one. It's actually that individual there. It looks like another little twig coming off, but it's incredibly hard to spot these guys. When they get close to pupation, we put moss in the bottom of the enclosure so the individual has something to go down into to pupate. They start to shrink down and go purple, and then they pupate fully. At this point, we pull them out of these enclosures, separate them individually so we can keep track of them. Once they've emerged out, they progress into our adult enclosures. So these are in our flight rooms. We've got capacity for 42 enclosures of moths currently within our 2 facilities. The room itself is air conditioned so that we try and keep away from extremes of temperature, but we try and still mimic what's going on in the wild for them. And they're put into these enclosures. They are made of PVC piping with a custom-made net to go with. They're actually designed for our pine hoverflies, also work really nicely for the moths. And we have 4 individuals in there, 2 males, 2 females per enclosure. As of this year, we're updating our methodology a little bit, and we're actually using the pop-up enclosures that we use for the caterpillars to give that a go, because it makes egg collection quite a lot easier, because they quite like sticking them just on the outside of the enclosure, which is a little bit of a pain. But hopefully they'll do really well in that this year. Within the enclosures, we have 2 pots of water. One of them has aspen and birch. This is to provide a good roosting site and somewhere for the adults to hunker away if they want to, especially being nocturnal, but also provides good egg laying opportunities for the individuals. The other one we put in has flowers. This is predominantly devil's bit scabious, ragwort and false chamomile, as these are the food plants we have 100% that's in them feeding on. But we also tend to provide a range of other flowers as well, just to give them as much selection as they want to. The other thing we provide food-wise is honey water. So the feeder on the left-hand side of the enclosure image is a 2-tiered piece of feeder which has little plastic pots in with makeup sponges saturated with a honey water mixture. This is the thing we see them feeding on the most. They seem to absolutely love it, and we often find them sat on the underside of the feeders when we come in the mornings. To track the adults at night, we have a nest box camera system so that we can see a little bit about what's going on with them and make sure everyone's doing okay, but we also mark all the individuals. So the image here is one of the individuals with a dot on its wing. We use a permanent marker pen just so that we can track each of them, and we track all of their genetics individually. We have a giant spreadsheet that we keep track of everybody, and we can track every individual back to where the individual they founded from the wild. To try and best inform that as we can. So how's the project been going so far? So we started off with 40 eggs that were collected from inch marshes back in 2022. We've got a couple of cousins here actually here on the original collections of them. But as of right now at Highland Wildlife Park, we have 6,199 eggs in our facilities. Because of the numbers we've managed to get, we've actually been doing releases over the last 3 years since 2023, with up to 2,500 individuals being released each year. So far, we've released 3,147 individuals, and hopefully that number will be increasing quite dramatically again this year with the sheer numbers we've had this year. Release-wise, we've been releasing on 2 sites. So our release site 1 is a piece of private land up near Abernethy Forest that's managed as a farm that has a couple of lovely areas with big exclosures which are encouraging the regeneration of the trees and such in the area. And this includes aspen. There are huge areas of aspen regeneration. So this is why this was chosen as our first release site. Our second one is just south of Aviemore on the Wildlands Estate, and is another area that has beautiful aspen regeneration. And because this area is being managed for habitat conservation, it's a perfect site for us to be able to do the releases on, and we started there as of last year. Release Site 1 was our first release back in 2023, and at this site we've now released a variety of different life stages. We've been trying eggs, we've tried larvae of early and late instars, and also adult moths. And it's at this site we've actually found individuals again on post going back and doing light surveys with them. So it's been really successful so far, and it's been so exciting to get to go back and see them. Release Site 2, this is being used as a trial. So it's our first release last year, and we've only released eggs there. The reason we're doing this is to see if egg releases are a viable option. It's the least labour intensive for us to do, and we're hoping is actually quite a suitable method. This year we'll be doing a significantly larger egg release. We didn't see any adult individuals last year, but it's possible it was just too small a number to get the population properly kicked off in a new area. But it's got some lovely habitat there. We're hoping the moths will take over there in the next couple of years. The big thing we've got to do is we've got to go back and monitor them. And this is predominantly done by our partner organisations, but we try and go and help where we can. And all the individual adults we release are marked. So we know any that we come across in the field are ones that we have not released as adults or in that adult stage. This is on the first time we went out and joined the surveys back in 2023 after we'd done that first release at our Site 1, and we found our first couple of adult male dark-border beauties in the field at that site, and I could not have been prouder going and seeing those individuals emerging and knowing they're ones that we'd bred at the park and are now going out into a brand new site in Scotland. The other thing that was super exciting as of last year was spotted actually mating individuals in the wild, and this is something even in the breeding programme with the amount of moths we have, I've only seen 4 times. So getting to see this in the field and seeing them breeding is an incredibly exciting step for the species. And it's just to highlight the little wing mark there where one of the females we put out. So the next steps of the project. We are very committed to this project, all our partners are committed to the project, so we're going to be carrying on continuing to monitor this species, the effectiveness of the captive breeding programme, the release successes, and updating our methodology to try and make sure this is efficient and effective as possible at trying to conserve the species. Later this year, we'll be working on part of a UK-wide conservation strategy for the species. This will incorporate the Scottish populations and the English population to give a much more structured plan for the conservation long-term of dark-bordered beauty moths and hope of preserving them in the long distance. We're also looking at doing research questions, so as mentioned earlier, about doing the trials with creeping willow with our Scottish individuals to try and better understand their biology, the egg trial releases to see how that effectiveness goes. We've got a few others really away in the background that we'll hopefully start working on over the coming years once capacity gets there. A big part of what we do is looking at the genetics. We're fortunate enough to have the wild genes team down in Edinburgh, and all of our individuals from the programme go down to the biobank after they die. And this means we're actually able to get some really substantial genetic information about the species. And as of next year, they will have hopefully caught up with us. So we'll be able to make pairings and genetic decisions for our individuals in captivity based on actual results that are current. So we'll be able to get advice from our team on who to pair up to maintain as much genetic diversity as possible. We're also doing work on comparing the 3 different sites in the UK and the European dark-bordered beauty moth population to understand their genetics as best we can. Work's ongoing to identify new release sites, and we're now looking at trying to work on ways of connecting these sites and to help make it a more continuous population rather than these quite spread out ones. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to get to a stage where they're starting to actually make self-sustaining populations of dark-bordered beauties. Thank you ever so much, everyone, for listening to me today. There's my email address on the email here, along with the Rare Invertebrates and the Cairngorm's email address. If anyone's got any questions or inquiries about anything to do with DBB, please let me know. I'm more than happy to talk about these guys for ages, as they're absolutely stunning species and very lucky to be able to work with them. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Hello, can everyone hear me all right? So yeah, my talk's in 2 parts today. So I'm going to give a bit of an update on some of our Scottish work to begin with. And then I'm going to move on to talk about a moth called barred two-striped. So I'm going to start in the borders. So many of you will know Epiphany, our Borderlands project officer. So Borderlands is a project in the Scottish borders of the south of Scotland, really, where we are aiming to get more sustainable management options for species-rich grasslands. Anthony gave an excellent talk earlier where he was talking about the various species of butterfly and moth that sort of butterflies that use species-rich grasslands. In the south of Scotland, northern brown argus is a key species that uses species-rich grasslands, and Epiphany has been, well, buying cattle collars by the dozen. So these cattle collars allow grazing of cattle in areas that aren't necessarily fenced with physical fences. The collars are essentially a virtual fence that put cattle in certain areas, and these allow much greater options for grazing. So Epiphany has bought so many collars, I'm not sure there's any cows south of Glasgow that don't have a collar on them now. But she's got a modest 150 hectares of grassland this winter being grazed by cattle with collars, which is really exciting. She's been creating new meadows with volunteers. She's been working around Selkirk to restore grasslands in that are parts of commons and golf courses and linking these up where there's kind of disparate northern brown argus colonies and creating more cohesive habitats. Despite being a dedicated vegetarian, she's been going around slapping butterfly-friendly stickers onto packs of beef, where the beef is being used to graze species-rich grassland in a sustainable way. And Epiphany is always on the lookout for volunteers. So if you're in the borders or the south of Scotland and you're keen to get involved, see some nice species, get into some nice grasslands, then please do contact Epiphany. Our contact details are there. And I want to come back to the point in the middle, which is already been raised today. It's a little bit dry, I guess, but bear with me as I go through it because it is important. So Todrig is near Hawick in the Scottish borders. It's a former sheep farm, and it typical borders extensive sheep farm, upland. Forestry has been proposed for that site, 400 hectares of Sitka spruce. Scottish Forestry, the government-appointed agency to regulate the woodland industry, made a decision that an environmental impact assessment was not required for this Sitka spruce plantation. A group called Restore Nature decided to challenge that decision legally, and the ruling came out a few weeks ago. And the ruling said that Scottish Forestry did not, well, there was two things that it considered, but one of them concerned Northern Brown Argus, and that was that Scottish Forestry did not adequately consider the needs of Northern Brown Argus when they were making that decision. Northern Brown Argus is on a list. It is on the Scottish biodiversity list, along with about 20 other species of butterfly and moth, and along with lots of plants and mammals and other species of importance in Scotland. That list is not just a list of species that are rare, but it's a list of species that are important in Scotland. Every government agency, so every public body, I should say, so whether that's NatureScot, Scottish Forestry, Forestry and Land Scotland, or your local council, they all have enshrined in law a biodiversity duty in Scotland. And that biodiversity duty should mean that they have to take into account biodiversity when they are making decisions in their general work. They don't necessarily have to act, but they have to consider it. So Northern Brown Argus being on the Scottish biodiversity list, basically Scottish Forestry knew the butterfly may be present, so they should have considered it when they made their decision about the environmental impact assessment, and they did not. Ultimately, that forestry plantation probably will go ahead, but we may now have a chance to get some mitigation for Northern Brown Argus. But it's really nice to see that the ruling came down and showed that these agencies do have to respect what's been enshrined in law. Well, I'd like to thank Restore Nature, who took this to court, or took this to a judicial review, for doing that and putting the resources into that, because that was a huge effort. I'd also like to thank Epiphany, because she had to give an affidavit to the court to say that Northern Brown Argus was present. So yeah, perhaps we could have a round of applause for Restore Nature and Epiphany, because that is a big thing. So moving to the coast now. So Species on the Edge is a big partnership project that we've been involved in for 3 years now. Incredibly, it is entering its 4th and final year, which is quite scary. We employ 2 project officers on this project, so Barry and Tracy, who are both here today. On the slide here is some of Tracy's work from this winter. So Tracy has been busy doing winter work parties as usual in stunning landscapes of the East Coast, where she's trying to conserve habitats for small blue and Northern Brown Argus. The slides on the top show Spey Bay, which is a Scottish Wildlife Trust reserve up in Spey Bay, funnily enough. And this is a really important site for small blue. However, in recent years, small blue numbers have been down, and the site has been increasingly inundated with water during the winter. So it's a low-lying site, it's just behind the beach, essentially, and seawater is coming over in storm events, and perhaps with slightly higher sea levels, and the water is sitting on the site for longer periods of time. So what Tracy has done is, well, she found a man with a digger, and the man with the digger made a really big mess. He has basically turned a huge area of gorse, which is on the before photo, and flipped it upside down. So the gorse is now buried under all of this lovely sandy shingle deposits. And Tracy has been busy with her bucket of wildflower seed and has been throwing kidney vetch and other wildflower seed all over that area. And what essentially we hope to do is move the small blue colony from where it's at risk down behind the beach, move it a little bit further to this area, which is slightly higher in elevation and slightly further away from the water, so that hopefully at this site, small blue can have a much longer term future. Keep going on the wrong keyboard. Tracy's also been busy on the Easter Ross coast. So this is a site called Shandwick, which is up near Tain. And through the Highland Nature Restoration Fund, we were able to secure some extra funds for our work in Species on the Edge. And Tracy found some rope contractors to dangle off the cliff, and they've been removing gorse. This is Tracy's life, basically removing gorse from these rocky ribs, so that we can protect food plants of Northern Brown Argus and small blue, but also there's a really rare plant at this site called purple oxytropis. So the work of Species on the Edge has been to really clear this area, and Tracy was delighted to find there was more kidney vetch and rock crows and purple oxytropis surviving on these rocky ribs than we thought there might be. And now that they're clear and that there's access into them for volunteers, we can hope to keep these areas open in future. Flying over to the west coast where Vary is our project officer. So Vary's recently in post. She took over from Liz, who left us in the autumn. Vary previously was our Species on the Edge trainee, where she was working on transparent burnet and marsh artillery. And she's now our project officer, where she's working on transparent burnet and marsh artillery. She's been, I was going to say she's been well trained, but I trained her, so maybe not. She can maybe answer that one. But Vary has been thrown in at the deep end and has been out chatting with landowners, giving them advice, talking to the Scottish Crofting Federation, giving talks, and she's also been busy with volunteers removing ghastly Cotoneaster from really important burnet sites near Oban. There's only 9 months of the project left, which is quite scary. So yeah, Vary and Tracy have still got lots to do, and I'm sure there's plenty of opportunities to get involved with their work if you're in those areas. So on to the other thing I'm really going to talk about, which is barred two-striped moth. So that's the moth here. It's a lovely, pretty little thing. It's quite a scarce species in Scotland, but it's also a species which is really under threat. And that's because in Scotland, this moth only feeds on ash. And I'm sure we're all aware of what ash dieback and the impacts that ash dieback has had in Scotland over the last decade or so since it arrived. So it's hard to know what the future is for this moth in Scotland. And the moth is present in other parts of the UK, so it's found in the south of England, it's found, I think, on the Welsh border, and it's found in Cumbria. But in lots of England, it feeds on wild privet and not ash. Wild privet isn't really a native species in Scotland, and we don't have much of it away from where it's been planted. So it's probably not using that in Scotland as far as we know. It's really associated with ash. So this is the Scottish range. This is what we know of barred two-striped in Scotland. So it's restricted to North Argyll and the Great Glen, as you can see there. A few of the islands, Skye and Mull. There's a sole record from Dumfries and Galloway, intriguingly from an ash woodland just to the north of Dumfries. There's unconfirmed reports from pasture. If you look on NBN, you'll find them, but there's no evidence that the moth, there's no photographs or specimens that the moth, so we're not certain about those. Before we started the survey that we've undertaken recently, it was known from 22 10-kilometre squares, which isn't very many really, and it was just 192 records, which again isn't a lot. I mean, those dots actually represent the records, so you can see it's not really very many. So actually, our baseline knowledge of barred two-striped in Scotland is actually quite poor. So in terms of like the basic ecology of the moth, it's closely related to a species that many moth trappers will know quite well, which is early two-striped. Both of these are spring flying species, so they fly in April and early May. On the right there, you have barred two-striped at the top and early two-striped at the bottom. So early two-striped can have a banded form, which is the one that's shown there, but generally it's less kind of well marked than that. But barred two-striped is always told apart by the nice chestnut colours on the wings, which early two-striped doesn't have. Both species are quite strongly attracted to light traps, and that's where most species of barred two-striped, most records of barred two-striped have come from light trapping. It doesn't seem to wander far from its core habitat. It doesn't seem to pop up in just random places. It seems pretty much restricted to where it breeds. Some studies in England have suggested that where it feeds on ash down there, that it might have preference for young ash. Lots of studies of Lepidoptera often say species have preferences for young trees, and sometimes that might just be because larvae are easier to find on young trees, because you can't look at a tree that's a branch that's 30 feet in the air. Could that be true of barred two-striped? Possibly. I'll come back to that later on. But a kind of new way to survey for the moth has become available in the last decade or so, and that is a pheromone lure. So for anyone who doesn't know, a pheromone lure is an artificially created chemical that mimics the pheromone that the female releases to attract male moths. So if you buy one, you just get a little rubber bung, and it's been impregnated with that chemical. And that chemical will attract the male moths. So you can, for barred two-striped, you can hang it up in one of those traps, which is on the photo there, in a woodland, come back in the morning, and the lure is suspended over a cavity, and the moths should hopefully settle in the cavity. Now, the chemical obviously isn't perfect, because early two-striped is also really attracted to the chemical. And barred two-striped is very strongly attracted, I would say, and so is early two-striped. It's a lure that works really well. Now, that lure was created more than 10 years ago, but it hasn't been commercially available in the UK. We were able to buy some from a wholesaler in Europe. But this year, for the first time, I think you can now buy the lure from ALS. Butterfly Conservation actually asked the stockists in the UK not to stock it because we were worried about the impact of lots of people using the lures and what impact that might have on woodland populations, particularly in the south of England. So basically, our survey had three aims, and a kind of side aim, not written there, is that there's lots of other moths, well, there's various other moths that depend on ash as a food plant, and there's lots of invertebrates that depend on ash. And we don't really know a lot about any of them and what impacts there might be from ash dieback. So we can maybe use barred two-striped as a little bit of a champion, I guess, for ash to see what the effects might be on other species as well. So our aims were really, what is actually the Scottish range of the species? Can we get an idea of how healthy the populations are? And can we lay down a baseline so that if someone else comes along in 10 years and repeats this survey, or hopefully we'll repeat this survey in 10 years, what's changed in that time? What can we learn from it? So our survey method was pretty simple. It was to take these lures, put them in these pheromone traps, leave them in a woodland overnight, return in the morning, count how many barred two-striped and early two-striped were in the traps. We targeted those 10-kilometre squares that had previous records in them, and we also targeted squares that were within or close to the current range that we suspected the moth might be present. And we were able to use maps like this. So this is data from the Native Woodland Survey of Scotland, which is freely available online from Scottish Forestry website, where you can basically look at what percentage, look at kind of composition of woodlands, so you can pick out the ash woodlands. So that's a way of targeting where to look. And these surveys were mostly carried out by our staff, but some volunteers also took part where they lived in kind of relevant areas. So the results of our survey after 2 years of surveying are the blue dots are the blue squares are the original records, that's kind of the range that we knew of them all. The green squares are where we've refound it. Those red squares are where we haven't refound it, but we have tried. And the remaining blue squares we haven't tried yet. Some of those red squares we have tried repeatedly in both years and we've not found the moth. Places like Ballyhoolish and Glen Nant, which we knew previously had decent populations that we can't now re-find. And these pink squares are new sites that we found for the moth. So some of them, like up in the Great Glen, perhaps unexpected. We knew there was ash, it was likely the populations would be linked. But some of them are quite interesting, so hopefully that's appearing on the screen. This one is way out in Ardnamurchan, and there's quite a lot of ash out here in Ardgour and Morven area. So quite possibly this is an area where the moth is actually present and we're not aware of it. And the moth has also been found south of Oban for the first time as well, down near Kilmelford. Again, there's quite a lot of ash down there. So we clearly don't fully know where barred two-striped is in Scotland. There's still more to learn. We also surveyed Perthshire. So NCS at Killiecrankie put some lures out last year, or sorry, 2024, I think, and we did some luring in 2025 as well, but no moths have been found in Perthshire yet. And Malcolm, who's talking to us this afternoon, tried down in the Dumfriesshire population, and again, he was unsuccessful. Certainly not conclusive that the moths are not at present there, but we've not found them yet. So what can we interpret from our results, I guess? Well, broadly speaking, the moth seems to be inhabiting most of its range before ash dieback arrived. So that's encouraging, but there are some exceptions. Numbers of barred two-stripe that we caught were generally very low. So the next couple of lines are in no way scientific, but just a bit of a comparison. So for barred two-striped, we had 33 successful trappings of the moth. 19 of those were single moths that arrived to the trap. And this is a species that we believe is very strongly attracted to lures. That was my best trap. I had 10 in that photo. But so basically 60% of our trap efforts resulted in a single moth where we had success. Whereas for early two-striped, which is a more widespread species and it feeds on different trees, we had 53 successful traps and only 14 were singles. So assuming it's attracted to the lure at relatively the same rates, we had far fewer single traps. I'm interpreting the barred two-stripe results that we had to one of the impacts of ash dieback, as I'm sure many of you will know, is that there's less foliage on the ash trees. Even when they're still alive, the foliage is reduced. So that would indicate there's less feeding opportunities for barred two-stripe caterpillars. So it might make sense that populations are lower. We discovered that early two-stripe is indeed a very regular bycatch of using this lure, and we had, I think one trap had 43 in Argyll, so it's a lot of moth for a little trap. Scattered ash trees seem to be really quite important for this moth. So if you drive up and down the Great Glen or North Argyll, there are woodlands that have quite a lot of ash in. They're presumably good population centres for barred two-striped, but there's often quite a few kilometres of between those pockets. And in those areas, maybe alongside roads or forestry tracts or canal in the Great Glen, there's just lines of trees that line those linear features. And there's the odd ash tree in there. And we put some of our traps under those ash trees and they recorded barred two-striped. So that would tell me that those linkages are probably quite important within, and that might be somewhere that ash dieback has a really big impact if those kind of scattered ash trees are lost. I would also interpret it that there's, if you go to these areas, there's not a lot of young ash. And young ash is really badly hit by ash dieback as well. Like ash can be prolific in emerging, like seedlings and saplings around ash trees, but ash dieback will just go through it and kill every single one sometimes. And in other areas of the Great Glen and North Argyll, there's really high browsing pressure and the ash is just not getting away. So the fact that we're still recording barred two-stripe perhaps tells me that young trees are certainly not critical for the survival of the moth. They might be important though, we can't say that. So the next steps for our barred two-stripe survey are to give it one more go this year with a targeted survey, revisiting some of the squares that we failed to find it in, but also surveying some of the squares that haven't been to yet, and perhaps trying our Arnhem and our Gower. Eventually, we'd really like to do some larval surveys, but I might have to hire a cherry picker for Patrick to be able to get up and count those larvae. Sorry, Patrick. Or you might quite like that. I think there's a high likelihood that our Scottish populations of this moth are going to become isolated and fragmented as ash dieback really takes hold. We know from Europe that 80% of ash trees will die from ash dieback. That's probably not painting a great picture for the moth. It's also really apparent to me visiting these woodlands in the west of Scotland that we need better quality native and ancient woodlands. So many of them are in poor condition. High browsing pressure, lack of ground flora, lack of young trees, lack of structure and diversity within the woodland, invasive species. there's lots of effort to plant new trees in Scotland, but we don't seem to be doing enough to manage the quality of the woodlands that we already do have. And there's evidence in Europe that ash dieback has lesser impact where you have high quality, good condition woodlands. So how can we expect our woodlands to have any resilience to ash dieback in the condition that they're in? To end on a slightly more positive note, there are some options for managing ash, which can maybe have an impact for Part 2 strict. So this tree here is an ash tree from an RSPB reserve on the west coast, and it's been pollarded. So often ash trees are removed for health and safety reasons now with ash dieback. So they're just chopped down and removed from the landscape so that they can't fall on anyone or a car or anything. But an option is to pollard them, which removes most of the high wood off the tree, and it often results in a spurt of growth. So you can see that the tree has resprouted from the cut areas, and that produces new foliage, which could be good for Part 2 striped, but critically, it retains the tree within the landscape. That tree is not lost, it's actually retained. So I think advocating for this type of management is a real option for the future, and yeah, that's something that we need to do. I will just finish by saying that, like Anthony said with the butterfly surveys at the end of his talk, we are undertaking moth surveys that we would like some help with this year. So species like barred two-striped, transparent burnet, clear-wing moths in the Trossachs. Kentish glory season is very close to us now. It's in April. Lots of people might be getting excited about that. That's another species you can use pheromone layers to find. And Portland moth at the back end of the summer, we hope to do some surveys for. So Anthony will send around details of how you can get involved in all these after this gathering. But thank you for listening.
So after all of the talks you've had by the professionals, if you like, all the people who know what they're doing, and now this is going to be much more of a story, some pretty pictures of butterflies, something a bit more relaxed to get you started again after lunch. It's about what's been described as a lost square, location that Gail and I have been out recording at for the last couple of years. So without further ado, there's NH97. Now, you might think Geoff's gone a bit mad. That's the middle of the Moray Firth. There's not going to be a lot of butterflies there. But then look a little bit harder. Look at the top corner of the square. It just cuts into the shoreline of the Fern Peninsula. Let's look at that a little bit more closely. Now we can see some land with some butterflies on it. How many butterflies are you going to get in that much space, you think? To just give a little bit, cut a little bit through that. The bit you can see at the very top where there's some little light-coloured cliffs facing southeast. That's a little sun trap, really warm in the local microclimate, and it's a great place for butterflies. There's great butterflies throughout the rest of it as well, but that is really good for butterflies. What that look like on the ground? These sorts of maps are never very useful. So this is what it actually looks like. Here's some typical north of Scotland weather conditions. Actually, up that part of the world, it's often like that. It's quite often quite nice. The Fern Peninsula really does have a microclimate. First one, top left, is looking down the coast from the north towards NH97. NH97 is kind of the middle bit where the last two headlands are. That just gets you a bit of context of you've got the shoreline low down, shore path along it, and then step up to the farmland above with cliffs and steep slopes between the two. So quite often quite hard to get through. The next one, top right, there's Gail enjoying her lunch. So just in the background behind her head is those little rich cliffs I was talking about. On that coast, wherever you find those light-coloured cliffs, you'll often find all of the kind of plants that we like, the rock rose, the kidney vetch, bird's foot trefoil, wild thyme, all of the good things. So funnily enough, we get lots of butterflies. Looking a bit more closely, this is close-ins on the same cliff. To the left, all the yellow dots you're seeing there are rock rose. That's what the left-hand end of the cliff, what we'd call the northern brown Argus end. Then we have the final bit on the right. That's got wild thyme with kidney vetch coming up through it. That's what we call the small blue end. Nice little spot. So all very nice. But first, a little bit of story. Why did we go here? So I'm now going to do the typical thing and blame my parents. After they retired, my father Brian and my late mother Barbara established a base on the Fern Peninsula. They were very into botanical recording, and that was in 1999. I should say Dad's watching this online just now, so hi, Dad. He'll be throwing corrections into the chat probably. By 2003, they were botanical recorders for East Ross, Vice Council 106, and from 2007, they were also moss recorders for a couple of years for that area. In 2005, they were wandering up the coastal path, doing botanical recording, as you do, and they noticed that some of their records were ending up in a square they'd never heard of, NH97, because they just wandered through that little bit of land and had some records there. And they found that there were no plant records for that square yet, at all. There were no butterfly records for that square yet, at all. No moth records yet, at all. There were a couple of other things. There was certainly plenty of marine stuff, as you'd expect, but nothing of those sorts of things. So that appealed to my dad's collector nature, and so he and Mum recorded very intensively in that area, and ended up getting, by 2013, they had 178 vascular plant species for that square. So that was quite an improvement. And also in the process, though they weren't focusing on that, they did record the first moths and the first butterflies. So on to those things. The first moths they got were the common nettle tap, which I've never yet seen one. I should say at this point that Gail and I we're quite good at butterflies. Moths we're learning. And the six-spot burnet, those were in 2011. But excitingly, they also found a small blue when Dad visited on the 20th of June 2013. So that is a square where the first ever butterfly record in the square is a small blue, which is to be relatively unusual. It was Dad's favorite square. It is Dad's favorite square. He talks about it a lot. So when Gail and I were getting into butterflies after the pandemic, we then, by 2023, were expanding that look at sites around Fern, making use of the base up there. And he talked about it a lot. So we walked out in September 2023 to go and look at it from the point of view of butterflies. And it turns out there are a lot of butterflies and moths there. It's not just small blue. But the small blue are obviously, from the point of view of our species on the edge and all that, are one of the very interesting species. So here's a couple of pictures I took last summer from that site. We've got adults at the top from May, I think May at some point, and also in May we've got that egg. It's good. It's a good site for going and finding the eggs. It's a relatively restricted area. Plants are reasonably easy to get to as long as you don't mind jumping over rocks. More excitingly for me, I've never previously got a small blue in caterpillar, so it was nice. It went back 2 months after I got the egg and found the fourth instar munching away. So that was great fun. The other interesting species, from the point of view of species on the edge of things, is northern brown argus, and it turned out there's a colony of northern brown argus there too, at the face of the cliffs, left-hand end. Lots and lots of rock rows there. The accessibility of the bottom end of the rock rows is a bit of a challenge to take secateurs if you go for fighting your way through all the overgrowth to get to the rock rows. Once you get further up the cliff, there's a lot of good rock rows, but that's harder to get once you've got a drone. So northern brown argus, another nice butterfly to have. And there's now just going to be lots of pictures of butterflies. I'm sure you're all cool with that. Browns and fritillaries. If you go there in July, there's graylings battering backwards and forwards across the cliff face. They sometimes come down to the wild thyme in clumps at the bottom and sit in nectar, which is great because then I can actually attempt to get a photograph of them. We've got speckled woods drifting through because they're all through that area now. I've been there for a long time, I think. Lots of the usual meadow browns, ringlets in the grass in front. I'm cheating slightly with the dark green fritillary. We haven't actually recorded it in the square yet, but I've recorded it maybe 100 yards north, and they are very common up and down that coastal path, sitting refueling on the nettle patches. So they definitely will be in NH97 at points. It's just I haven't been there when I've been there yet. But they make a very pretty picture, so I wasn't going to leave them out. Also, all the usual Benessids, red admirals, small torts. I'm cheating slightly because again I've not recorded it in the square, but same story. They're all over the place there. Painted ladies pass through, lots of peacocks. Then on the blues, we've got the small coppers are a great help when you're chasing northern brown argus and small blue because they dogfight with them. And you can't necessarily see a small blue at any great distance, but you can see the small copper blasting around dogfighting with something that you can't see. So it's a very good way to identify where the small blue is. It's a good trick also for northern brown argus as well. They both benefit from small coppers about to locate them. There are common blue, not so many probably common blue right in NH97, but there's definitely a few that have been recorded there. So all the usual suspects. More prosaic things, there is every kind of white. I found out I have never got around to actually photographing a large white there, but they're definitely there. Green, that's a nice thing. I like the nice markings on that green vein. It was a nice one. But you get literally all your butterflies in this nice 100-meter wide space. How are we doing on time? Perfect. Now, that was a general romp through the butterflies. Now we're going to talk about a bit more specialized second broods of some of our more interesting butterflies. Because it's a sun trap in that nice little microclimate, you do seem to get second broods. I'm going to caveat it just slightly at all points because proving a second brood is going to be quite hard. But if you remember, I said the first time we went was in September of 2023. And on that visit, we saw a northern brown argus adult egg laying. That's the picture up top left. That was the telephoto picture. That was a good way up the cliff face, so I couldn't get in to see the eggs being produced. But on the same visit, the bottom left picture is a very freshly hatched northern brown argus egg from the rock rows down at the bottom where we could get. We also got the top right where we've got small blue eggs. Again, hatched small blue eggs, but very pristine and not broken down at all yet. So pretty sure they were recent, and if that's in September, that's pretty likely second brood. So we went back this last summer, intentionally looking for small blue second brood in the middle of August, and met bottom right a pristine small blue. There were a couple of them around in the middle of August. So I think that's pretty certain that that's the second brood. I'll leave that to the experts to cast judgment. I see some of them in the back row. And so it's a nice, and the sites up that coast in general are good sites for that kind of activity in good years. It's only going to happen in good years. Whether it's good for the individuals involved is a different question, of course. So the final butterfly thing. This was a surprise when Tracy gave me the records for the square. When I asked her what's been happening there, what's the official version. There was a species on it I didn't know was there, the dingy skipper. And there's a record in the official records from 2021. And it was the terminal on the record was Tom Prescott, so it must be true. It's very plausible. Right food plants are there. Great environment for them. There are known good colonies 10 kilometers northwest on the Tame Dunes, 15 kilometers southwest at Logie Quarry. So it's pretty likely they're there. So that's definitely for us to target for this year. We're going to go back and find them properly and get some pictures and stuff. This one, by the way, is from Logie Quarry, so it speaks with more or less the same accent. So that was butterflies. Now out of my comfort zone, over into the moths. There are lots of nice moths there. I tend to find I'm usually there chasing small blues, northern brown argus. So I'm running around, and then a moth jumps out at my feet, snap a couple of frames, move on, try and catch up with that small blue that's heading off into the distance. But I've had some nice things over the years. Now here people will probably correct me, throw something up when I get them wrong. So wood tiger top left, yellow shell top right. Well, the obvious things like the silver Y, the migratory ones. The burnets there are 6 spots generally, so that's the only ones you seem to get there. We also have shaded broadbar. We've got mother Shiptons. And I'm carefully looking at my notes, make sure I get these right, because they get difficult towards the bottom. The silver ground carpet, and a very poor picture, I'm afraid, of a pale straw, a hot straw pearl. So it's a great place for day flying moths and being able to see them, take photographs of them in a nice environment with perhaps some small blue to look at as well, or northern brown argus. Then we get our conundrum moth, which I'm just labeling as a bell. And this was the classic. I was chasing a small blue. This popped up on my feet in June 2024, 1st of June, and fired off 2 frames just to capture it, and moved on chasing my small blues. Looked at it later and went, I don't know what that is. I have to look it up, and found out it was a bell, but it could of course be a July bell or a lead bell. Now it's on the coast, and I've been told since that therefore makes it much more likely a July bell. But 1st of June, if you look in the books, certainly about the time distributions of emergence of these things, that's very, very early. So we actually logged it as a lead bell in our naivety. When we dug in further and it went through to the recorders and things, apparently the 2 species are sufficiently close that some individuals are fully ambiguously marked between the 2. I'm sure the people in this room know more about this stuff than I do. And that this is one of those individuals, and you cannot tell from that image which of the 2 species it is. It's an ambiguous one. So the action there is that we need to go back again, go back there, get some more pictures of more moths so that we can take them through recorders and work out what the colony there actually is. So that's going to keep us going. Cool. So if you've enjoyed some of this stuff you've been seeing and you think it's a great site, you might want to visit it, how are you going to do that? The sensible way to do it is to park in the relatively good parking at Hilton of Cadball down at the south end. And where they've got a picture stone with a big field to park in, so it's very easy from parking point of view. And then walk up the coastal path from the south until you get to you can see the little yellow bit, which is the little bit of NH97 on land. The downside of that approach, I mean, it's all lovely coastline, but that stretch of the coast is less interesting than the coast between NH97 and Rockfield. Rockfield is possible to park. I have done it a few times. It is a bit fraught. If anybody has any contacts in Rockfield, please talk to me afterwards, because I'd love to find someone who's got a bit of space I could park my car without being shouted at. Would be good, because between NH97 and Rockfield, we've found, I mean, there'll be many more, but we've found 3 northern brown argus colonies and 1 further small blue colony in that space. There's lots and lots to find along there. Lots of those little bits of pale-coloured cliff turn to the south, always worth bashing in through the gorse at that point and finding out what might be lurking at the base of the cliff. There is another option which we've never done, my dad's done once, is to come in from the top. There's actually 2 trackways down from Mains of Genies, but to do that you'd have to negotiate with the farmer and things at Mains of Genies to be able to park your car. There's not really a lot of space for parking on the roads up there. But it's a closer option if somebody was ever to say moth trap in there or something like that, radical like that. So thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the pictures. Couple of last things. I just wonder if lost squares like that probably a bit unusual, but you've probably got some neglected or unexplored little locations around closer to where you are. Always worth going and looking at these places. You never know what you find. Always worth going and nose around. You might find somewhere with this sort of number of butterflies just by going out and looking. And thanks Tracy, Rick Monroe and Mary Eagleson for the butterfly and moth record help respectively. Couldn't do it without you. And thanks to Dad for giving me the idea in the first place, because it's been great fun.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Zhilin. Last year, I was a postgraduate student at the University of Edinburgh. For my dissertation, I collaborated with Butterfly Conservation Scotland and did research about the small blue. The topic is the future of the small blue in Scotland. First, I will briefly introduce the target species. It's the tiniest butterfly in the UK, and recently it experienced population decline and habitat loss. Now it is classified as a near threatened species. it's a species with low adaptability. It's mainly because it's single food plant, larval host plant, the candy witch, this yellow flower here. And for most of them, their colony is small and fragmented, and according to most of the research, their dispersal ability are quite limited. I would say, although in England and in Europe it's not that endangered, but in Scotland it's a species with restricted distribution. You can only find them mainly along the east coast with some inland clusters. I know that this year and last year, the volunteers from Butterfly Conservation, they found some new habitats, but it's not on this map because when I did this research, those kind of data sets are not ready. So the topic is under the climate change, human activity, coastal erosion, and biotic interaction, I'd like to predict the future of the endangered spot blue in Scotland. The method we used is called Maxent with those occurrence records, and we give them the climate and environmental layers. We can predict the current and the future habitats suitability, and some scientists call it the presence probability. So the Maxent basically asks, given the environment where the species is found, where else does a similar environment exist? So based on this logic, we can identify those unidentified habitats and to predict the future habitat change. So because we would like to predict the future, one of the most important data set is to get the future climate prediction data set. I choose the data set called CHILSA with 2.1 because it's the most up-to-date future climate prediction data set. It predicts the future use the baseline climate conditions from 1981 to 2010, and it provides 3 future scenarios from 2011 to 2040, from 2041 to 2070, and the last one is from 2071 to 2100. We built 4 Maxent model for small blue. The first one is a basic model, the climate only. We use climate data which is related to small blue's life cycle, such as the winter minimum temperature, the February temperature, because previously there's a research proved that the February temperature is really important for small blue. And for the second model, we add the environmental layers such as slope, aspect, land use, and soil condition. And for the third and fourth model, we use 2 different methods at the influence of the biotic layer. In other words, is the availability of the candy witch, their food plant, and larval food plant. And here's the result. So this is the baseline models based on the current climate condition. So the dark blue means this area is suitable, especially suitable for small blue. And the yellow area and light green area means it's not that suitable. And if we go to the future, I will show it again. You could see that there might be an inland shift for the suitable habitats, and based on Model 1 and Model 3, their coastal habitat, the majority of the coastal habitats may disappear and not suitable for small blue anymore. But you can see that there is a difference between those models. It's basically because the first model, the climate-based model, is like totally based on the climate. So if the climate condition is not not suitable for small blue, then it would say like this area is not suitable for small blue. But for other models, because other predictors also influence the small blue. So, for example, for like Model 2 and Model 4, there will be some suitable coastal area for small blue because there will be cleavage in this area. Although the climate condition is not that suitable, but there's enough food, so they might still be there. And is there any? I shouldn't go. And we also consider another factor is the coastal erosion. Based on the dynamic coast, they list the recent coastal erosion in Scotland. If you still remember the distribution of small blue in Scotland, there are some overlap, right? So we use two methods to identify the erosion-prone coastal area. The first way is to use a database provided by Dynamic Coast. So based on this 2,100 high emission scenario, we can know which area will be influenced by coastal erosion. And the second way is my supervisor's former PhD student have a finding that the offshore slope will indicate whether a coastal area would be influenced by the coastal erosion. If there's a gentle slope lower than 0.025 meter per meter, which means this coastal area will be stable. And if there's a steeper slope, the coastal area can be eroded in the future. So if we overlay those two layers on the previous habitat suitability map, we can say that for some coastal area, even from the maximum result, they will still be suitable for small blue butterfly, but with the coastal erosion, those suitable habitat may also disappear. So will there be a local extinction or habitat shift inland? It's really hard to say. I would say like there's no model that is 100% correct, but some models can be really useful. So based on this model, there might be a local extinction, but it also depends on the small blue's dispersability. Although as I mentioned, I said like for small blue, generally their dispersal ability are quite limited, but some research shows that in hotter years, they have much better dispersal ability. Some individuals can move 10 kilometers to find a new habitat. And it also depends on the land use because, for inland area, there are more human activities, so who knows? And also it depends on the habitat connectivity and our conservation strategies. That's all I'd like to share today. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So as Simon said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at BC, and I'm going to talk about some work that I've been involved in recently and the work that was published last year. So this is looking at our non-native moths that have arrived and established in Great Britain, and we're looking at the trends and how that's changed over the last 120 years. So we know that non-native species are increasingly arriving in new locations and establishing, and the issue that comes with that is that about, on average, 10 to 15% of those species can become invasive. So a recent IPBES report that's on the screen documented the issues with alien and invasive non-native species and kind of shows some of the impacts that they can have. So they can have impact on our native wildlife through predation, through competing with resources, through transmitting diseases, and then this can lead to extinctions of some of our native wildlife. But then it can also have really big economic impacts because of the damage that these species might cause and the methods used to eradicate them. And this can then have impact on human quality of life as well. So a recent study by UKCH actually looked at the impact of invasive non-native species on our insects. This is actually a global study, so global insects. So Lepidoptera aren't on here, unfortunately, but just showing that invasive non-native species do have an impact on our native wildlife, our native insects. In particular, in these groups, you can see there's a decline in abundance, particularly for Hymenoptera across those groups. And some of those invasive non-native species that it looked at were insects. So it is important that they can have kind of impacts on the native insects too. So it's really important that we try and understand the changes in non-native species over time, how many are coming across, are they establishing, and particularly how is that changed over time in relation to some of the drivers that can cause some of these species to come across. And that just helps us to be able to try and develop effective policy and biosecurity if some of these species become invasive. So for the study, we obviously looked at Great Britain and moths, and GB is a particularly good study system for this because we are an island. We have a natural barrier that allows really easy detection when these species do arrive in Great Britain. As you all know, we have amazing citizen science recording data for moths. So this allows these arrivals to be really quickly picked up and recorded through our schemes. And then moths in particular are a good study species for this because they can arrive by the two main means that I'll go on to talk about next, how species can come across to Great Britain. So they're very sensitive to climate change and they are transported by other means as well. So there are two main modes of colonization and how species can get from where they are native to Great Britain. The first is through human assistance, and we call those species adventives. And then the other is through natural immigration. So we just call them immigrants here for ease. So adventives can come across unintentionally through things like the timber trade, timber production, through the horticultural trade when ornamental plants are taken over, which has been going on for a long time, through tourists as well, but also deliberately through things like the pet trade and then releases for control of other species for biological control. And then species come across here through their own steam as well. And this is predominantly due to climate change. So as we've heard in quite a few of the other talks, that climate change is causing species to shift their distribution northwards and polewards. So this is just an example of the red-necked footman in GB, where we've seen a really strong distribution increase into Scotland. So these species are coming across that way, and sometimes climate change is altering their dispersal ability as well. So species are maybe more able to get across and over the natural barrier that we have. So species can get to the UK through these two methods, and it's important that we look at these differently to try and understand the kind of underlying mechanisms behind why those species or how those species have come across. And then for a species to arrive in the UK and GB is one thing, but then for them to actually establish and become a breeding population, they need the right host plants to be present. So we looked at whether these species fed on native host plants, and so since those host plants are already present, then it's really just their ability to get to Great Britain is their limiting factor. Once they're here, they've got the plants there to survive. And then obviously a lot of these species feed on non-native host plants, so they may not be here because either they've not been transported yet, but they may have been, or climate change just hasn't allowed those plants to catch up. So they may be more limited by that resource than ones that feed on native host plants. So for this study, we used data from Mark Parsons. So he's published 3 papers actually categorizing or documenting all the non-native species that have established in Great Britain from the 1900s all the way up to 2019. So there's 142 species in total. So when we got the data, we wanted species to be split into whether they had come across through human assistance, so they're an inventive, or whether they came across through natural immigration. So we actually had 2 moth experts. We had both Mark Parsons and Tony Davis actually categorizing these species, which was a lot harder than I expected it to be. Quite a bit of trickiness within it. Some species were actually maybe an overlooked resident. Then there was also some inevitable disagreement between the 2 moth experts. So we only kept species where there was a definite decision on what category that was, and obviously left the ones that might be overlooked residents as well. So here's some of the inventives. I've tried to pick out species that are either established already or have been recorded in Scotland that you might see. And we've got the decade that they were recorded to be established in. So we've got a few there that you might have seen before. And then some of our immigrants as well that you also might have seen, including the bedstraw moth, which is just pretty spectacular. And then we class those species as whether they feed on native or non-native host plants as well. And we also, in this, we considered whether they were found in the range of that plant being native. So for some species, they fed on Scots pine, but if they weren't found in locations where Scots pine was native, then we class that as a non-native, feeding on non-native plants. So our overall aims were just to look at how have the numbers of non-native moths changed over time. And then we looked at this for ones that have come across through natural immigration and feeding on native and non-native host plants separately. And then we did the same for adventives, so looked at how they have changed over time and then feeding on native and non-native host plants. So we didn't look at actually what the underlying drivers of these were. The data were quite tricky to compare to, for example, climate change or trade data. But because we know of those underlying mechanisms, then we can kind of imply of why we might think these species have come across. And in particular, we were interested in whether that rate has stabilized recently. So actually, maybe we're not too concerned that we're going to risk having some invasive species in Great Britain, or that rate might have accelerated really recently because of anthropogenic climate change, or maybe some opening of trade routes. So that's just something we really didn't know and felt it was useful to find out to help with biosecurity. So the first aim was just to look at all moths together and how they've changed, the numbers have changed over time. So out of those 142 that were in Mark's paper, we had 116 that we were certain on whether they were an adventive moth or an immigrant moth. And then this is the change over time. So we have the number of species on the y-axis and time on the year on the bottom. And these are grouped into the 12 decades that we looked at. So you can see in the first decade, 1900 to 1909, we just had 1 species that established. Then the last decade, so 2010 to 2019, we had 18 moths established, non-native moths established. So this corresponds to a significant increase over time, and that increase is about 22% per decade on average. So each year, there's about 22% more moths establishing in Great Britain than there were the year before. So quite a substantial increase, and probably a bit stronger than we expected. And the main thing to note was that that was continuous. That hadn't plateaued or plateaued at the beginning and becoming more significant over time. That was just a continuous acceleration. So we then looked at those that have arrived through natural immigration. And out of those 116, we had 78. So just over half the numbers have come over by their own means. So this graph over time looks slightly different in that those first 3 points with the dashed line, basically there was no significant change, so a stable trend in the number of those moths establishing. And then from the 1930s, we see a significant increase up until the last decade. And that corresponded to a slightly lower rate of increase, so 11% per decade, although that's over a shorter time period. So I would expect there to be a lower rate there anyway. And then if we look at those that feed on, so those moths that come over through natural immigration and that feed on native host plants, which was the majority of them, 69%, they follow a very similar trend, actually. We do get a significant change over the whole time period rather than that sort of step change that we saw for all species. And that was a 23% increase. So each decade, 23% more than the year before, than the decade before. And then the remaining ones that feed on non-native host plants still a significant increase, but just not quite as strong. So a 13% increase over time, so over each decade. So not quite as strong. So what we show from this is that the trend between all immigrant moths and those that feed on native host plants are similar, that points more towards it being a climate change related driver, because those plants are already there, whereas for the non-native host plants, they need those host plants to have arrived. But what we found interesting was that we thought there might be a significant increase from sort of the 1990s, which is where we see the most impact of anthropogenic climate change, or recent anthropogenic climate change having an impact. But actually this increase was from the 1930s and beyond. So it points more towards there being long-term changes in climate, which has been documented from kind of the early 1900s, causing this change over time, not necessarily just recent anthropogenic climate change, which obviously is also having an impact. And then when we look at those that have arrived through human assistance, so the adventive moths, about a third of those out of the total number were adventives. So this is the change over time, which was again significant for the whole time period. So this is accelerating, showing no signs of slowing down. And that rate of increase was 26%, so quite similar to the total number of moths. So each decade, 26% more moths establishing. And about half of those fed on native host plants, but showed a slightly slower increase at 22%. And then 16 of those fed on non-native host plants and had a very similar trend to those that feed on native host plants. And there is a gap there because a few species we don't have the information on, or sufficient information on their host plants to know exactly what they were feeding on. And that rate is 26%, so quite similar to the ones that feed on native host plants. So again, this is kind of showing that the drivers behind species coming across as adventives hasn't gone away or hasn't slowed down or hasn't had a great impact recently. It's that consistent change over time from the last 120 years. We're not seeing any slowing down of species coming across through these trade routes, or probably quite a lot of these species, especially the ones that I showed on the screen before, most of them are through the horticultural trade. That's how they've come over. So it's really not showing any changes. And I've also noted that climate change is probably going to make this even more suitable for these species. So we can't obviously tease apart some of these effects. It'll likely be a combination of climate change and human drivers like globalization and trade. So just to summarize, we found that the number of non-native moths establishing in Great Britain has increased over the last 120 years, and this is showing no signs of slowing down. And we think that changes in long-term climate and the global trade have led to these increases, and this is likely to just keep going on. Our climate is still expected to keep changing, and new trade routes are opening. So this will, I think, continue leading to more non-native moths establishing in Great Britain. But I will note, obviously, this isn't necessarily always a bad thing. These moths that come across can boost our species diversity. And as long as they're not having a negative impact on our native species, then that's great. But because the numbers are accelerating, it does increase the risk of some of these species becoming invasive at some point in time. So it just really highlights the importance of developing some of these effective biosecurity measures, and they'll be different for each of the modes as well. So for adventives, it's about managing trade routes, and natural colonizers, if they do become invasive, it'll be about eradication methods. So it's been really important to understand the difference between these two. So yeah, that's it from me. I just want to say thank you to volunteers and everyone, all the recorders who contribute to all this amount of data to let us look back so far. Thank you.
Right, hello, I'll be your host for this talk. I'm Malcolm Haddow, and I work for the Environmental Record Centre for Ayrshire, Dumfries and Galloway. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of environmental record centres, LARCs. Most of you will have one, although I'm aware it's not perfect coverage in Scotland. But just to give you an introduction, we cover Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway, and that's 5 vice counties in the southwest of Scotland. And record centres are managed and set up in different ways. Our one's under a NGO, the Southern Uplands Partnership. We're a project under them. Other record centres are on their own, so TWIC's constituted in its own organisation. Some are embedded in local authorities as well. But the role of a record centre is basically to collect, manage, provide, safeguard wildlife information, and we've heard a lot about that this morning. And our key role in that is providing that. So we've heard about forestry developments and things. Having those records at hand is really handy. We can provide those to consultancies. We can't control what they do with those records, but at least we've provided them, and they can't say we didn't actually know those were there, which is quite important. As part of that work, we do a lot of events to get recorders, volunteer recorders, to get more records. And at the moment, we're sitting about 4 million records for the southwest of Scotland. That sounds quite like a lot, but actually, once you map it over that area, it's not that much at all, really. And there's 2 of us in post, myself and Mark Pollitt. Mark does a lot of the office stuff, and I do a lot of the outside exciting stuff. But Mark does help me from time to time. So community engagement is a core part of our work now. The reason being it's about getting more recorders. Dumfries and Galloway and Ayrshire is quite a rural part of the Scotland, and as best as we try, I can't quite cover all that area on my own. So trying to get new recorders is very important. It's important to get more records. And it's important for engaging communities with wildlife, especially communities that aren't engaged already. So just to give you a flavour, last year we delivered 75 wildlife events, and that partnered with over 88 different community groups, organisations and landowners. So it's a big part of my work. So I'm going to introduce you to our community moth trapping that we do. So before we started really with the community moth trapping in its current form, originally what we did is we'd set up an event in a community, but we'd usually set the trap up ourselves. That would probably be in a private space or a public space. And then we'd publicise it widely and see who turned up. And that's what we used to do. But this is who we'd get. So we've got Richard and Barbara Mearns, Alison Robertson, so are already converted, basically. So you get lots of your interested parties, which is great because they can identify all the stuff that we can't. But in terms of getting in members of the community who aren't already interested in moths, it wasn't necessarily that successful. I don't necessarily know why the reasons are, but I've got a few insights that might be the reason. I think generally the public at large are not at all aware of the diversity of moths, the colours of moths, the exciting nature of moths. I think for the average person, there's untrue preconceptions of moths, that they're brown and boring and eat your socks. When that's like 5 species of all the moths or something. So it just didn't seem to get traction for whatever reason. And then other issues with community mothing events is weather. You know, weather's a big impact on any wildlife event. But in the west of Scotland, as we've been hearing, the weather's particularly temperamental. And with community events, you usually have to set a date and go with it. So you might just end up with a quite dreep day and you're left with about 4 Hebrew characters or something like that. The other issue with community events and leaving a trap is security concerns. We have had traps that have been vandalised. We've had equipment stolen. So that's always a concern. The other thing is there's often other events going on in communities. We might not necessarily know about that, but we might have set an event and found out, oh, there's actually a local football game that day, in which case we're up the creek without a paddle, basically. So these are all issues we've had. Another one that's just a bit of fun, really. We have had people phone us up to say there's a UFO in my neighbour's garden. So there's an issue with light pollution, I guess, is another thing we've had to think about. So how did it start in our current format? So our current format came about in 2011 when Peter Norman, who at the time was the biodiversity officer for Dumfries and Galloway Council, was asked by a local community group in Kirkmaiden, which is in the Galloway Rins, to come and do a moth thing. That was all the thing he was given. So Peter came up with the idea of lending traps to members of that community group. So they were spread out between members of that community. Peter was also able to ask members of the community if they knew landowners in that area to increase the area of search, and they did, which was very useful. We got the local school involved, and it worked really well. And it worked so well, they asked them to do it 3 more times again. So it worked really well as an engagement tool for general members of the community. And we sort of took it, and over those years, we did quite a lot of community moth trapping. But it sort of came to the next level in 2019 when we did a whole project about it. So we did a project called Moths at Home, which was funded by a landscape scheme, Galloway Glens. And we did 6 events in the southwest of Scotland along the Ken River Valley. And the idea was to get these traps into people in the community to get people engaged in a different way with wildlife. So in that event, we did 6 events along the Kendy Valley. We managed to set 35 traps. Of those 35 traps, we had 34 unique volunteers, which is quite something. And we managed to cover 19 different 1 kilometre squares in southwest Scotland in that project. And we got about 120 people involved. I know that doesn't sound a lot, but that's like half the population of Dumfries and Galloway. So for us, that was very good. And that's sort of the outcome of it, really. It's fantastic for PR photographs, by the way. So yeah, these are the people who have come along to our events. It amazes the kids, especially the kids get to hold some of the bigger moths, and they've never really thought about moths, and then they've got an elephant hawk moth in their hand, and their whole worldview's changed basically. So it's really great. We've done some at schools, get the schools involved, and they can tie that into their art classes and into their studies. So it works really, really well. But as well as an engagement tool, we get lots of useful data. So during the Moths at Home project, we recorded just under 2,000 moths in total of 204 species. Most of those are common species, but they're probably of common species in places we didn't have records for before, which is just as important as us as a record centre for records for. But we've also been getting some nice things. I've just picked a few random ones. So we've caught blood vein a few times at our community moth trap events, quite a rare moth in Scotland, and I was very excited by. Actually, David Hill saw this when we caught that at Borg, and he wasn't very impressed because it had a damaged wing, and I was quite aggrieved by that, I have to say. I was very excited. Old Lady, we've caught a few times in community moth trapping events. That's surprising because they don't often come to light traps. And in fact, a number of years ago, Mark Pollitt caught one in a trap that had no other moths. Got to the bottom, and they're saying to some of the trappers, "Oh, there's an old lady down here." It's, "Oh yeah, what rubbish are you talking about?" He brought out an old lady, which is quite a nice one. Got Great Brocade, which I think is increasing in Britain at the moment, but a nice bog species. And we'll probably get more important records of micros than anything else, actually, in the southwest of Scotland. So I'll put pied smudge up there, which is quite an attractive little micro moth that we've caught at a few of our community moth trapping events. But more importantly still, one thing that it's helped us do is recruit new moth trappers. There's not that many of us in the southwest of Scotland, so the opportunity to get new recorders is a big win for us. So we've had Peter and Val Russell, who are on the right there. We recruited them after a community moth trapping event, and now they trap every year in Annan, which is an area we didn't have a regular trapper in to begin with. So that has been a big win for us. And we've managed to recruit a few more over the number of years, which is very good. So why does it work? I think the biggest way it works is it gives members of the community a vested interest. So how it works is we give them a trap, they put it up in their garden, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Well, I don't really know about moths, but I want to know the moths that are in my garden." So it gets them interested. They often then invite their kids or their grandkids, they invite their neighbours, they go to their bridge club and say, "I've got this moth thing happening." And we get a network of advertisement in that community. One of the key things to make it work is getting a local contact. So although we are local to Dumfries and Galloway, we don't necessarily know the people to talk to in Kirkbean or in New Abbey or wherever it is. We usually latch on to some poor member of the community council. I would say, "Can you help us?" And they usually know people in the community that are interested, and that's our way usually of recruiting in that community. And we might say it'd be nice to get as much widespread in that community council area as possible. And they say, "Well, I know Jimmy Crawford who's in that farm there, I'll go see, we'll have one." And that really works well for us for getting coverage in those communities. One of the great benefits is the traps are usually then in an enclosed space, so we don't have to worry about vandalisms or theft of traps. If they're in someone's garden, they're much more secure, so there's less of an issue with that. And again, having that local contact probably allows us to get a wider sampling area than if we did it on our own, because we're able to get more volunteers. So what have the benefits been for us? Well, to be candid, it's allowed us to get better funding opportunities. Funders love it when you throw kids at moths. Oh God, moths at kids. When you throw moths at kids and you get some photographs of kids with moths all over them, it looks great for funders. So it's enabled us to get into more funding streams for our core work. It allows us to raise the profile of various issues in communities that are maybe not aware of the issues, things like climate change. We've taken case studies of different moths and the impacts of climate change. It allows us to get people thinking about recording and into recording. It gives us records, which we're always in need of more records. It inspires new recorders, which is massive for us, getting more people recording. But it also helps us improve links with those communities. We rely on the communities for records, for events. It's allowed us to build on those relationships and do further events afterwards, which is very good. And it's all just about getting people involved, really. It's very, very popular for us. It's very successful. We do an annual moth trapping event in the village where our office is based in Cairgunnion. We did a Solway moth project in 24, which was just similar to moths at home along the Solway coast. We did one in South Ayrshire last year in Carrick. We'll be doing something very similar this year in East Dumfriesshire. We do one in Nith Raid every year, which is in Dumfries, where they race boats up the River Nith, and we throw moths at people. And it's a very busy event for us. And it's our go-to engagement tool. So of all the events and all the things we do, it works really, really well at getting regular people, no offence, members of the wider public involved with moths and recording. It works really, really well. And that's really the gist of how it works. So I hope that was interesting.
Okay, so thank you for having me here again. So I've been tasked with, by the rest of the BC Scotland team, to wake you all up before you go home. So I hope you find this presentation interesting. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Patrick Cook. I am an ecologist at Butterfly Conservation. So part of my work recently has been looking at how moths respond to woodland expansion. And we've been working at this wonderful site called Marlodge Estate, which some of you might have heard of. And we've been looking at sort of the different moth communities that we find across the estate as a way of sort of predicting what might happen in the future as we see woodlands expand. So for those of you that are maybe not so familiar with upland landscapes, I'm going to give you a bit of sort of context behind why we're seeing these sorts of changes in our uplands first, and then we're going to dive into the exciting bit about the moths later on. So when we think about uplands, generally I find them quite a sort of binary sort of landscape. So they're largely dominated by areas of open moorlands, like we see in the top picture here. So this is managed either for sort of deer stalking or for sort of grouse shooting as well. But we also have these fantastic semi-natural woodlands that still remain. So our native pine woods, upland birch woods as well. And what we're seeing is that currently there's an increasing pressure to expand this woodland cover, largely led by targets through the Scottish Government, but also because of our interest in the biodiversity value of these upland woodlands. And what I'm interested in is what changes do we see in terms of our moth communities as we begin to see this transition towards more woodland cover in these landscapes. So the Scottish Government has set really high targets. So it's around about 21,000 football pitches a year we're trying to create of new woodland. A lot of that is being achieved by tree planting. And as we've heard today, that can have sort of negative consequences for some of our butterfly and moth species if not done sensitively. Now, the other way, unsurprisingly, to expand woodlands is to allow trees to naturally regenerate. Who would have thought after millions of years that trees could actually manage to do that? Now, as I sort of mentioned on the last slide, though, we do have that sort of issue of very high, artificially high deer numbers. So what some of these estates are doing is reducing their deer numbers to a level that allows natural tree regeneration so that we see these woodlands begin to expand. Now, this is particularly occurring in the central and eastern highlands in our native pine woods. So you've probably heard of examples like Cairngorms Connect, what I'm going to be talking about today, like Marlodge. And this is a really sort of interesting habitat in itself. So this used to cover quite wide areas of the uplands. Over sort of thousands of years, it's declined, partly due to sort of natural climate change, those land use pressures that I mentioned earlier on, and particularly those sort of high deer numbers. So what we have now is these small sort of fragmented habitats that are particularly threatened, particularly when you go to the west side of the country. As we get into the central and eastern highlands, as I've mentioned, these sort of projects have reduced deer numbers to some extent, and we're beginning to see the sort of expansion to their natural sort of altitudinal limit again. But what we understand as these projects progress is sort of the tree recruitment side, so plants, we understand how birds are responding as well. But it was a real bugbear of mine that we didn't really fully understand what's going to happen from a moth perspective. And that's what I was really interested to understand as part of this project. So to do this, we teamed up with the National Trust for Scotland Mar Lodge Estate. So this is the largest national nature reserve in the UK. It has 3 important fragments of Caledonian pinewood. So in Glenderry, in Mar Forest and Glencoich. And it's also sort of an ongoing project. So it's been started about sort of 20, 30 years ago. They're also doing lots of work in sort of montane zone as well. So sort of montane willows and other alpine habitats. If you want a bit more detail about the estate and some of its management objectives, I really recommend going and reading this book by Andrew Painting. He's a good pal of mine and he's really sort of talented writer. So he'll talk you through the sort of challenges that they've faced to do these management approaches. So as they've applied this sort of approach, they've reduced deer numbers. What we're seeing is that the woodland, these native pinewoods are beginning to spring back. And we have less of a binary landscape now at Mar Lodge. We're beginning to get a sort of blurring of different habitat types, more of a mosaic coming into the uplands. And the way the estate has done their management is quite clever. So on the north side of the estate, they've reduced the deer numbers. That's their regeneration zone. On the south side, they've retained sort of the sporting interest. So in the top left-hand corner, we've still got landscapes that have got that very open moorland without any trees. In the bottom left for you guys, we've got these sort of early successional woodlands coming through. So these are areas of regenerating pine and birch that's still retaining those important sort of moorland features as well. And then finally, we've got those remaining fragments of mature woodland. So fantastic sort of granny pines interspersed with birches. We get patches of sort of juniper, and then that understory layer of blaeberry and heather. And we would expect that across these 3 different habitat types for our moth communities to change across them, support different species. But what we want to understand is how much change there is between them in terms of species, abundance, and then the composition. So that's exactly what we did. So we selected areas at Mar Lodge. We looked at the number of species in those 3 habitats. We looked at the abundance, so the number of individuals. Then we looked at community composition. So that's my first sort of researchy term of the day. So if you're not familiar with community composition, basically you take all of the species and the abundance of those, and it sort of boils it down into this big Venn diagram, which I'll show you later on. And then the final thing, which we'll only touch upon lightly today, is we looked at some of the habitat features that moths respond to as well. So like percentage cover of trees, canopy openness, all those sorts of factors. So when we were setting up the project, we had 3 areas of each of these habitats. So the purple dots in the bottom are our moorland areas. So these are the areas that are being retained as sort of open moorland. There's still sort of sporting interests on them. They're very representative of the sort of deer densities that we get in wider Scotland. On the north side of the estate, we have our patches of early successional woodland and mature woodland that we moth trapped in as well. So in total, we had 54 points across the estate, and we moth trapped at these twice. So we ran a total of 108 light traps. So this was at the end of June and start of July, and then the end of July and start of August. So a really great way to get sort of sleep deprivation is being out sort of doing all those moth traps. But I've never been so motivated to get up at 3:30 in the morning before to check the traps. So just to give you a sort of indication of the landscapes we were trapping in, we can see some of the sort of moth traps in situ here. So in the sort of open moorland and then in the mature woodland. We use these low power 6-watt traps because they're quite portable. Also, they don't attract moths in from a very far distance as well. So it means we can relate to those local habitat structures. We also had a really great team of helpers. So I'm presenting this a bit as an individual today, but without the help of a lot of folks that were here in the room today, it wouldn't have been possible to put all these sort of traps out across the estate area. And these are some of the lovely moths that we found as part of the project. So we recorded a total of 115 species of 2,977 moths, which I was pretty pleased with, given we were using these sort of low power traps. We were trapping up at about 400 at 500 meters for the study. So our most common species were true lovers knots and engrailed clay, but we also had a nice selection of sort of more upland and northern associated species. So like some of the species you see on the screen, so we had Scotch annulet, grey mountain carpet, lots of sort of scarce silver wise, few more sort of northeast specialities. So in the top corner, this wonderful orange and white micro is Catoptria permutatalis, and also a few nice things like cousin Zhilin, which are quite range restricted as well. So a really sort of fantastic moth trapping experience. And the estate are very open to folks going and moth trapping if you get in contact with them as well. So moving on to the exciting bit, we took all of that data, boiled it down into a big stats pot, and then out came all these graphs, which was really exciting. So first off, we're talking about species richness. So this is the number of species that we saw across these habitat types. So I've represented this in box plots. I'll talk you through these if you've not seen it before. So the black line across the middle of the box plot is the median. The width of that box is where 50% of the data occurs. And each of those dots represents a site where we moth trapped that. So the number of species recorded in that trap. Our statisticians then went and did some fancy statistics, which I don't fully understand, so please don't ask me any questions about them at the end. And when they did all the statistics, we found that the highest number of species were in the mature woodland. So that's not too surprising. That's what we would expect to find. This is the most diverse habitat in terms of structure. It's got more tree species, which are really good for supporting higher numbers of moth species. The other key thing that we found when we looked at this is if you look at the mature woodland, we've got a few dots that are really higher on the species richness numbers. That's where we begin to see these broadleaf elements coming into our native pine woods as well. And this is what's actually lacking from our Caledonian pine woods because of the history, the way they've been managed for timber in the past, the high deer numbers. We've not seen the sort of regeneration of the birch trees. But by having a bit of birch in these stand interiors, we can see this boost occurring to the moth numbers. And what's also quite distinctive as well is because you get that birch element, you begin to get slightly different species occurring in that as well. So next up, we looked at abundance. And again, when it came to abundance, we had the highest number of moths in our mature woodland. So in upland landscapes, if we want to promote more species richness and abundance, we have to protect these existing core fragments and look to expand them in the long term. But what we also found was that there was higher abundance of moths in the early successional woodland compared to the moorland. And I think this is a really important result from our study. So this habitat, these early successional woodlands, are largely missing from our upland landscapes, as I mentioned earlier on. But actually, I think for a lot of our upland moths, this would be part of their sort of native habitat associations. When we look at examples in Scandinavia, this sort of scrubby light woodland with moorland is a really common habitat feature. So nice to be able to sort of show that rise in abundance, probably related to the fact that there's more diversity, so the tree species for food plants, but also increased shelter in that habitat as well. So next up, we looked at community composition. And for the first time in my life, we were able to produce this graph, and I felt like a proper scientist when this graph came out. I was really pleased, and then I had to read up on how to actually interpret it. And I thought, oh, this is going to be complicated. And then I realized it's as simple as actually sort of reading a Venn diagram. So what the stats basically do is they take all that species information, all that abundance information, and it puts each point in space. So each of these points represents an individual moth trapping location. We then draw a big ellipsis around each of our three habitat types, and then we've basically got our Venn diagram. So in purple, we've got our moorland. In light green, we've got our early successional woodland, and in dark green, we've got our mature woodland. All you need to be able to do to interpret this is just look at how much those ellipses overlap. or not, or how much they sit out on their own. So we had 3 key results from this particular part of the study. And for me, this was our sort of most important results in terms of upland land management for moth species. Firstly, when we did various statistical tests, we found each of the 3 habitat types supported a slightly different assemblage of moths. So they all have individual value. So having that mosaic of habitats is really important to diversifying moth communities in the uplands as a whole. The second thing is that when we look at the moorland, we see that there's a few points that sit out on their own. And I think this is a point that will resonate with the room here today, is that as these woodland projects progress, we need to retain some areas of open habitat. It's important that we don't go wholesale and just have treed habitat. And that's because some of these species actually prefer open ground. Also, when we look at some day-flying moorland moths, things like associated with bearberry, like small dark yellow underwing, we know from sort of other studies that they need relatively open areas. The third key result, and I think the most important thing from our study, is look at how varied that early successional woodland is. We can see that it's a massive ellipsis area, encompasses a lot of the variation we see in the moorland, a lot of the variation in the mature woodland as well. And what this means is that after 10 to 20 years of deer control, we begin to get these young woodlands coming through, but they're extremely diverse for our moth species. They support open ground species associated with moorland, side by side with species that are also associated with trees. And what we also found is that a lot of those moorland species did very well in that habitat type. So they can tolerate this sort of light, scrubby tree cover. That's important because this habitat type is pretty much completely missing and not sort of occurring in these upland landscapes. So by reducing those deer numbers, we can achieve really good results for moths in about 10 to 20 years. So that's sort of everything that I was going to say in terms of our results today. If you do want to sort of dive a bit more into the detail, particularly to look at the sort of habitat features and so on that I've only briefly touched upon today, we have published a scientific paper, so you can go and read this in Ecological Solutions and Evidence. Feel free to also email me as well, any questions. Obviously, I'll be here afterwards to answer some questions now too. So I'm just going to leave you with a few sort of take-home messages to sort of think about in terms of moths in the uplands as these woodland restoration projects progress. The first thing is that these mature woodlands are absolutely essential. So protecting those existing areas of Caledonian pinewood, looking to expand them in the future, is a way that we can maximize the number of species and abundance of moths in our uplands. But we do need to have a mosaic of different habitats. So retaining some areas of open sort of ground is important for those species of moths that require that as their habitat preference. And that means we'll get more diversity in our habitats in the upland sort of landscapes as well. The final point, and as I said before, is the most important one, is that these young woodlands can really help support these moth communities in that short time period, 10 to 20 years. So that's all I'm going to leave you with today. My final thing to say is just a big thank you to all the helpers on the project. So all the co-authors, sort of statisticians, all the BC volunteers and NT staff, sort of presented this individually, but without all of this team of people and funders, it wouldn't have been possible to be standing up here. So I hope that's a sort of interesting end to your day and leaves you with some food for thought in terms of the future of our upland landscapes. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.